back. Hope you guys are all doing well today. This week we have gotten into starting our next unit of this course for world history. We are looking at the modern era. Okay, so specifically for this week, we've been taking a look at the Cold War. We've taken a lot of looks at how did World War II end, getting into the topics of what were some of the major fallouts. And so today, what I really want us to focus on is this question of who started the Cold War, the United States or the Soviet Union? So, just as a refresher of some of the bigger topics that we've already kind of taken a look at, we know that there's a difference in ideology between running a country by communism or capitalism. Okay, so communism is the belief that the Soviet Union was kind of running under, and capitalism and democracy is the belief that the United States was falling under. So we're already seeing a little bit of tension between these two ideas of government systems here. Previously, the United States and the Soviet Union were allies in World War II. Previously, the Soviet Union did join Germany in invading Poland, trying to get territory back. However, Germany turned on their ally and ended up going back on their agreement and invaded Russia, invaded the Soviet Union. And so Soviet Union ends up joining Britain, United States, and helps them defeat the Nazis World War II. So there's already, there's a little bit of a tension, but there's some relationship there that helped get to the end of World War II. Now, after World War II, Europe was destroyed. Okay, a lot of France, a lot of England, all of those major Western European countries had just been completely decimated. Towns were ripped apart, a lot of money had already been spent towards war efforts. The population size even was struggling as men had gone to war and lost their lives. And even in other parts of the world, as these major crowns or major governments were kind of stagnant, trying to rebuild after World War II, a lot of the colonial empires, the colonies in Africa and Asia, those start crumbling as well because they aren't having the money come in. They don't have the support of the bigger countries back in Europe. So, again, like we're seeing these economic and physical devastations happening throughout Europe, Africa, and Asia. Now, we're going to start seeing, as we've kind of talked about and seen already by the arms race, the space race, this increased type of competition that is building up between the United States and the USSR or the Soviet Union. And this idea of the Soviet army, they took over Eastern Europe and East Germany. This ends up becoming known as the Soviet bloc. The United States kind of takes on this idea of containment and is helping rebuild Western Europe, taking control of Western Europe, and, again, just really helping them build up. And so it became this competition of who can be best, but we also don't want the other side to be good. And we see a lot of propaganda starting to increase between the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States is all about increasing democracy and containing communism. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, they do not believe in democracy. They believe in equality for all through the means of communism, government control, things like that. Now, in particular, we're going to get into today a little bit more of these specific policies of, specifically the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, along with some other ideas and topics to see and help answer that question going back to who started the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, in the beginning of this week, we had a big focus on kind of what was the Soviet Union doing? Why were we in competition with them? What were they doing? Why were they kind of seen as the bad guys? But we weren't necessarily taking a hard look at ourselves as a country and thinking, okay, how could we have been seen as the bad guy throughout this situation, throughout the Cold War? And so that's what we're really going to take a look at today is answering this question of like, who started it? Because both sides were doing these things to ourselves and to each other. So let's get into this for today. We're going to take a look first at the Iron Curtain speech. Now, the Iron Curtain speech, took place on March 5th, 1946 by the former Prime British Minister Winston Churchill. He came to the United States actually to give this speech because we still had a great relationship between ourselves and England. A lot of generational ties, thinking all the way back to colonial times. Obviously, we have a close relationship. Our culture is close, our relationships, religions are very close to England. So we're going to keep that tie there, especially as we help them through World War I and World War II. Now, in this Iron Curtain speech, we hear the thoughts and ideas of the West and their perspective on building each other up after World War II. And a part of that building each other up, we start to see this idea of an us versus them. Okay, so one of the first major statements by Winston Churchill that kind of sets the USSR off is called, Winston Churchill makes this statement: from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in Adriatic, and an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Okay, so automatically creating this divide between the West and the East. They had both agreed up to this point, yep, we're going to help rebuild this side, you help rebuild that side, right? They made that agreement with Russia, with the Soviet Union at the fall of World War II, as they kind of divvied up Germany. And so by saying that we now have this iron curtain between the two ideas, it's creating an us versus a them kind of sentiment, a mindset per se. And so we really start to see this idea of Anglo-American ties that need to be strengthened. Okay, so the United States was helping and the United Nations was helping to promote this peace, but it's again that us. Okay, England, United States, it's us. And we need to contain, we need to keep these ideas from spreading. Now, actually, Russian historians to this day still view this speech as the start of the Cold War. Okay, pay attention to this date. 1946 is when we're starting to see England creating this us versus them mentality after World War II. So we're going to take a look at this speech. Okay, so it's about 5 minutes long. Sit back, relax, and just kind of listen as we hear Winston Churchill's famous speech called The Iron Curtain.
It was, of course, a very big day in the history of Fulton, Missouri, when President Truman and Winston Churchill paid their visit. About 30,000 people had invaded this small Middle Western town, and if we don't see many of them in the street, it's because they were crowding the campus of Westminster College. But what we might call the collection of another degree wasn't the big event this time. It was Churchill's speech, now awaited by about 3,000 people inside, 30,000 outside, and the rest of the world. It's a pity, but the cameraman's strong lights always worry Mr. Churchill on these occasions. President Truman introduces him.
It's a pleasure to me to introduce Mr. Churchill. He's one of the great men of the age. He's a great Englishman. He's a great Englishman, but he's half American. And it's one of the great privileges of my lifetime to be able to present to you that great world citizen, Winston Churchill.
This is how Churchill began his address in Westminster College, Missouri.
The name Westminster somehow or other seems familiar to me. I feel as if I'd heard of it before. Indeed, now that I come to think of it, it was at Westminster that I received a very large part of my education in politics, dialectics, rhetoric, and one or two other things. The President has told you that it is his wish, and I'm sure it is yours, that I should have full liberty to give my true and faithful counsel in these anxious and baffling times.
The strong lights were making things difficult for him, and at this point it was necessary to dim them, which rather spoils the picture, I'm afraid.
Neither the sure prevention of war nor the continuous rise of world organization will be gained without what I have called the fraternal association of the English-speaking people. This means a special relationship between the British Commonwealth and Empire and the United States of America. Ladies and gentlemen, this is no time for generality, and I will venture to be precise. A shadow has fallen upon the scenes so lately lighted by the Allied victory. Nobody knows what Soviet Russia and its Communist International Organization intends to do in the immediate future. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. I do not believe that Soviet Russia desires war. From what I have seen of our Russian friends and allies during the war, I am convinced that there is nothing they admire so much as strength, and there is nothing for which they have less respect than for weakness, especially military weakness. If we adhere faithfully to the Charter of the United Nations and walk forward in sedate and sober strength, seeking no one's land or treasure, seeking to lay no arbitrary control upon the thoughts of men. If all British moral and material forces and convictions are joined with your own in fraternal association, the high roads of the future will be clear, not only for us, but for all, not only for our time, but for a century to come.
Winston Churchill had spoken as a private citizen, but it goes without saying that his words carried the full authority of his unrivaled experience as Britain's great war leader. Let us hope they receive the very serious attention they deserve from all quarters.
All right, so that took place in 1946. A year later, our president, President Harry Truman, 1947, enacted and pushed this idea of the Truman Doctrine. And while this helped countries, it was pretty controversial at the time. The intention behind the Truman Doctrine was to provide political, military, and economic assistance to the countries that needed it in order to rebuild after World War II, right? Countries are devastated, they're torn apart, they're trying to rebuild at this time, and the economy of Europe is also going to affect the money and economy in the United States. It's primarily the region of the world that we trade with. So we need to help Europe get back up on its feet so that way we don't get pulled down with it following World War II. So the intention was to help these countries build back up. And it's actually one of the first times that the United States really breaks its previous stance of not getting involved in international politics. Previously to this, the United States was very for isolationism, that we're going to focus on ourselves unless it's, a huge enough international deal that's going to eventually affect us. So proactively getting involved in international issues, this is what the Truman Doctrine really was. And the intention behind it was, again, providing money, inserting money into European countries that needed to help getting rebuilt after the devastations of World War II. Now, here's the clause that kind of upset people throughout history. The money of the Truman Doctrine, it was tied to stopping communism. You could only get this money from the United States under the Truman Doctrine if you were not a communist country. Okay, so it's tricky in how this money is being tied to government structures. If you weren't a democracy, you didn't get this money assistance from the United States. And that was seen as being pretty backhanded on behalf of the United States. We pride ourselves of helping all, furthering the cause for all, but tying money to help and food, political means, helping others, tying that to money and tying that to ideas, it was seen as pretty shady on an international level. So the United States makes this statement that they were compelled to assist the free peoples in their struggles against totalitarian regimes because the spread of authoritarianism would undermine the foundations of international peace and hence the security of the United States. This was the rationale given by President Truman in order to give money to countries throughout Europe. Now, imagine being someone on the Soviet side of this Cold War and hearing, oh, so we're not going to get help because we don't have the same government structure. Just because we don't have the same government structure doesn't mean we also don't need help. And so again, it goes back to this shade from the United States towards countries that were not democracies following World War II. Now, we also saw another injection of money into Europe in order to help, which is known underneath the Marshall Plan. Now, the Marshall Plan was named after its brainchild, or the brainchild of George C. Marshall, one of the major generals in the United States Army. And this was another year following. Okay, so we have the Iron Curtain speech in 46, the Truman Doctrine in 47, and now the Marshall Plan in 1948. This was roughly worth $15 billion, again injected into Europe in order to help rebuild, and this one was not tied to a style of government. Okay, you could be communist or not, and you could still get this money aid package from the United States in order to rebuild. Now, the conference where the plan of how are we going to give this money out, how are we going to implement these different assistance programs, there was a whole conference where leaders of countries were invited to come in order to help strategize. The Soviet Union was invited to this meeting as well in order to help rebuild Europe as a whole. However, Soviet Union did not attend. Okay, so we're again seeing a little bit of shade from both sides of this issue within the Cold War. Now, the money again was intended for economic development measures, such as helping rebuild cities, helping to build up factories and get going infrastructure issues again, really to help the United States trade with Europe like we had previously. Now, the United States, again, is giving their rationale of why are we giving out this money to Europe? It's to halt the spread of communism on the European continent. So they're inviting in the Soviet Union to this conference to strategize, but they're also telling the world we're specifically putting this money out there to halt the spread of communism, which was the style of government the Soviet Union had. Now, while this plan wasn't shady in the aspect of like tying money to government ideas, there's still a little bit of shade coming from the United States because our CIA, which is a government branch, or it's a bureau underneath the president, they actually use this money in order to set up business fronts to spy on Soviets and spy on governments throughout the Soviet bloc. Okay, so they set up missions in the Ukraine, Czechoslovakia as a business front using the Marshall Plan money in order to, again, stop that spread of communism. They're gathering intel, bringing that intel back to the United States, where they had used that money for the business fronts. Okay, so again, we're kind of seeing, we're really questioning again, who started the Cold War, the United States or the Soviet Union? So to finish out kind of like, what are these two sides of the Cold War doing in order to antagonize each other? Well, in 1949, we have the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO. And underneath this alliance system, we see the United States, Canada, several European nations that are joining up together and agreeing with each other in order to be against the Soviet Union. It's a mutual agreement between each other that if you are attacked, we are also viewing it as us attacked, and we will go to war with you. So again, setting up those alliance systems that we saw that were kind of an issue leading us into World War I, World War II. Now, the goal of the NATO alliance was to be economically strong together, to rearm Europe, and to integrate ideas back together. Yada, yada, yada. They helped implement the Marshall Plan that we just talked about. And again, the Soviet Union did not join. Now, the Soviet Union was also telling Eastern European countries, if you join NATO, we will not give you money. We will not help you. So money really became this bargaining factor for all of these little countries that had been destroyed by Nazi Germany. And they're being pulled by both sides. The United States, who is saying, if you're a communist, we're not giving you money. Yet we've got the Soviet Union on the other side saying, if you join NATO, we won't give you money. So they're being torn back and forth between these older sibling-like superpowers. So in retaliation, or as a way to form alliance and kind of protect themselves, two ways of seeing it, we have the Warsaw Treaty Organization that's created 6 years later. Again, we're kind of questioning who started the Cold War. Thinking about these dates here. Now, the Warsaw Treaty Organization included the Soviet Union and some of those other Eastern European countries, the ones they had agreed to help take care of after World War II to help rebuild. And this was, the intention behind it was to have a counterbalance to NATO. Now, NATO, bunch of countries getting together, talking about money, and implementing different policies. The Soviet Union did want to make negotiations with these other major powers throughout Europe. And that was the intention, is to have an alliance, protection, and to help make peace talks and negotiations with these other countries. Even though they weren't in the same alliance system, they wanted to negotiate there a little bit. And it was important to bring countries together under a unified front because there was a lot of civil unrest that is happening in Eastern Europe at this time. After Nazi Germany left these smaller countries like the Czech Republic, like Poland, Slovenia, Hungary, Romania, there's no leaders left behind. And so there were different grabs for powers, leading to protest and arrest, all of these things. And so there needed to be an overhead power to kind of organize what was going on. This is why we got the Warsaw Treaty Organization. It's an older brother kind of helping step in, bring rest back to these areas. And they had an emphasis specifically on really not trying to interfere with its members unless it was really necessary. So again, we're really seeing like who was being antagonistic in this situation. We know that there was obviously competition going on between the United States and the Soviet Union. We have money that is kind of being used as a bargaining chip between littler countries throughout Europe. We have the arms race where we see the development of nuclear weapons. We have the space race, so trying to have better technology than other parts of the world. And again, propaganda, right? Like you could probably ask your parents or grandparents what their thoughts are on communism. And we've been told basically our whole lives in the last 50 to 60 years, communism is bad. You know, if you're a communist, you're bad, things like that. We have these ideas kind of ingrained into our society. Same with the other side. Okay, I'm sure if you were to go ask someone who's now living in present day Russia their thoughts on democracy, they would probably have the same ideas because they grew up in that culture that was anti American at the time. So, what we still want to do is go back to thinking who started the Cold War, the United States or the Soviet Union. So, what you're going to do for me today, now that you kind of have this summary of information, we know the different strategies that were implemented following World War II, you're going to go take a look at 4 different documents for me. They're labeled A, B, C, and D. And you're going to answer these 4 questions for me as your submission of an assignment today. So, after hearing this information, after going to look at these 4 documents, you're going to tell me who was responsible for the start of the Cold War? What evidence do you have to support your claim? Which of these documents do you believe is the most trustworthy and why? And what other evidence do you think you would need in order to strengthen your claim? Okay, so take the time with what we have left of class, go take a look at those 4 documents, and then please answer these 4 questions for me and give me your thoughts. Be honest. As long as you're using evidence to back up your opinions, there's no wrong answer here. Please let me know if you guys have any questions. I'm always here to help.